Hi, everybody. My name is Benjamin Hunter, and welcome to my presentation, Black Music, Full Stop. The purpose for my talk today, the reason that I'm here, is to talk to you guys about black fiddle traditions in this country, really the Americas. It's not to merely talk about black culture in old time sense, because it's really larger than that. So my purpose tonight is not just to talk to you about, origin stories or whatnot, or early accounts of historical accounts of black string bands, but rather that there's a long lineage of string music that exists within this culture. I can't talk to you about this music and talk about the things that we are going to talk about today without acknowledging the fact that this moment in time right now is happening as a result of recent events that have, developed an outpour of anger and frustration and shock at the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. But even in the days since George Floyd, there have been murders by police against black men. There's been hangings. There's been all sorts of deaths, and demonstrated the true force of police forces across America, and exposing that fault, exposing that lie that black folks and people of color and indigenous folks experience on a regular basis in this country. And so I can't help realize and point out the fact that we're having this conversation because of these events. But these events have happened before. We've had this happen countless times in this year already, before COVID. Last year, the year before that, the year before that, the decade before that, the decade before that, the century before that, the century before that. Something is different about this moment in our history. COVID is deepening the the understanding of fear, of uncertainty, of maybe an exposure, or maybe it's that people have more time on their hands so that they can care about these things in a different way. I don't know. There's myriad reasons, but pointing out the fact that we're having this conversation because of a result of that. I want to thank Fiddle Tunes for reaching out and making this this part of this particular event. And while this is a reactionary step and a step that needs to be taken, that folks are unaware of the depths to which black culture exists within America's folk traditions outside of the blues is problematic. But it is the 21st century. We should all know better. And so, this presentation at least hopes to provide some sort of overview for you all to do your own work. So what I'm going to try and do is just give you a brief history of black music in America. But I'm also going to talk to you about this idea of absence versus erasure, or rather absence towards erasure, uh, and explore how, you know, well, we'll get to what we're going to explore there. And then in the last little bit, what I want to do is just even in the United States of America, give you a another like generalized groupings of music as it relates to um, what we consider folk music, what we consider uh, um, popular music, what we consider traditional music, um, and just identify some pockets of this country where Black and Indigenous and Brown music is still very prevalent, yet is somehow absent from the conversation, and therefore gets erased by it through systems of oppression. Some really uh, light stuff uh, is what we're going to be working with today. So it's been my observation that there has been little to no Black or POC presence at the Festival of American Fiddle Tunes since I've started going there 5 years ago. Granted, I know that's only a little bit of time. Not in the practitioners, not in the audience. I've gone through the archives and I know that there has obviously been um, folks represented through the decades. But as a Black person who plays American music professionally, I'm left woefully unsatisfied by the lack of Black, Brown, Indigenous, POC practitioners at this festival and a plethora of other festivals around the country. It was told to me that to qualify to teach at this particular festival, you got to be able to impart, traditional technique and playing style that one represents must be from a legacy of tradition, right? So as to render to the student or participant an authentic, culturally traditional style of fiddle playing. This is most often presented in the forms of Cajun, Quebecois, Irish, Cape Breton, old time, and blues. So in those 5 years that I've been coming, there were three were POC representation again, and in 2017 it was Rhiannon Giddens. She came and demonstrated traditional fiddle styles as learned from the great Joe Thompson. Um, Due to imbecilic border politics, that year also saw the replacement of a Mexican fiddle group by the addition of a tribute band of the region, of the sorts, playing in the music of the famed Juan Reynoso. Paul Anastasio led the group, and obviously a great scholar in all respect to the interpretation of the music. My first year, there was a duo from Brazil playing classical music from the region, but also interspersed some folk tunes. They were super impressive. And then my fourth year, I believe it was my fourth year, Belen Escobedo joined with her band playing Tejano music from San Antonio. And they were superb. I understand the argument of creating a festival that showcases the practitioners of long held traditions. There's a purpose there to preserve the string traditions in a setting that is multi generational and open to interdisciplinary interpretation. But my question, which you should know is coming, is why is there always represented traditions of white culture, and only sparingly, if any, representations of Black and Brown culture? In my 30 years playing music, half of which is committed to Western classical teaching, the other half is committed to exploring world folk music with particular attention to American roots music. What people call traditional music bothers me. It rubs me the wrong way because traditional means, traditional music, sorry, by nature, changes from generation to generation. The advent of recording technology provided this reference of what something was supposed to sound like, but oral culture reinforces the fact that things are going to evolve as it passes through. Well, I'm hoping that I can give a history. and that's going to be very quick. We don't have that much time again. I want to talk about absence and erasure. Absence of an African American fiddle tradition or brown or indigenous fiddle tradition is due to a series of systemic conditions that are not experienced in a white context. And three, I just would love to kind of quickly give an overview of the breadth and scope of diversity of this music that makes up American fiddle music is, and how like some of these questions that we're looking at right now, or at least that I'm asking you to think about, directly pertain to the struggles that are happening right now on the streets with Black Lives Matter. This is all woven into the same cloth. I'm going to take you through some recordings, so you're not just going to be looking at me. I'm going to put some pictures up and stuff like that. So you're going to have something else to look at, but except this. But and just listen and write down questions and feed them to Joe. So here we go. So often is depicted when, of the fiddle is the European version of the violin. Scots Irish traditions that came across the Great Pond to influence all ranges of America's folk music scene. Right, this is true. But the tradition of bowed string players, bowed string playing, isn't unique to Europe, right? Countries all over the world have versions of bowed instruments. But in West Africa, uh, all over Africa, there are a variety of bowed instruments. The orutu in Kenya, the gonje of Ghana, um, all of these countries, then territories, right, had versions of one string, two string fiddles um, in their possession, played much like um, a violin, as you can see here. Now, these techniques and styles of playing were brought with the enslaved Africans who were forcibly brought to this country, and necessarily there was a merging of cultures because the Celtic, the Irish, and Scotch-Irish folk were there. And there was this merging of Celtic and African musical traditions, each adopting the others. It's important to note, right, that in the early days of America, before slavery, quote unquote, was established as we know it, indentured servitude was the classification which Africans were made to serve. But this was also largely just for lower class Irish folk, right, that were brought over and for a number of years, 30 years or so, right, you would work and you would pay off your passage across, or some such absurdity. But it was in those early days that the first musical entanglements happened that lent themselves to, a lot of the wonderful old time string band music that we are aware of and listen to and love today. And so those styles and techniques were used, right, on the Nyanyero and the Rutu and the Gonji were applied to Western style violin, paired with the banjo, otherwise known as the Nkontin or the Ngoni or Gimbri of different parts of West Africa. These are the two folk champions, right? Not only did both cultures have highly polyrhythmic music, but traditions were based around dance. And so for hundreds of years, this music would mix together, reshaping itself into something new. Right? It would happen in the plantations, and it would happen in the mountains and in the hollows, and it would happen in the barns and on the fires. But it was rural. It wasn't meant for parade or presentation in that sense. Ironically, in the beginnings of this country, this music was one of the first racial equalizers, in a sense. It wasn't until the end of the 19th century, when minstrelsy left his ugly mark, did this music start to evaporate out of African American traditions. So, sort of. Note that it wasn't until 1649 that slavery laws were put into place, reserved specifically for Africans. So that there was 30 years after the first Africans were brought over for indentured servitude. Fast forward to the mid 19th century, 1840s, minstrelsy, yet another stain on our country's history, not only brought this music to a larger audience, but from an academic perspective, gives us proof that this music comes largely out of an African American tradition. The first banjo player from the Virginia Minstrels learned his repertoire and styles from African Americans throughout his circus circuit. People learned from African American banjo players on their plantations. Minstrelsy was hugely popular in the 19th century. It was one of the more popular styles of music, sweeping across the nation. Ironic that what made it so popular was not just the gross imitation in the use of blackface, but more profoundly, the more sincere attempt to learn and engage in the music of black culture. The relationship between minstrelsy and old-time music remains very close for about 50 years or so. Minstrelsy was almost like a gateway for African American musicians to step foot into the entertainment industry. From it developed the countless myriad other styles of music created, popularized, and eventually exploited by and from black culture. W.C. Handy himself is quoted as saying, "The minstrel show at that time was one of the greatest outlets for talented musicians, talented Negro musicians, and artists, All the best talent of that generation came down the same drain. The composers, the singers, the musicians, the speakers, the stage performers, the minstrel show got them all. And so, as minstrelsy started to fall off in the late 1890s, although still lasted for quite a bit longer, performers were forced to move into other scenes, such as vaudeville or theater. But what spawned from it was traveling minstrel shows, which eventually helped pave the way for robust musical circuits that promulgated other black music from cultures throughout history. It was also about this time that the music recording industry started to peek its head out. This is a fundamental moment in shaping the future conception of this music, right? Because when beginnings of the industry started, music execs had really no clue what they were doing, and as was and still are the times, created the industry on the assumption that black listeners wanted to hear country blues and gospel because that's what black folks listened to, presumably. And white listeners wanted to listen to string bands and country and religious music because that's what white folks presumably listen to. This act alone shaped generations of future listeners' minds as to where this music came from and clearly from where it was going. But we know that there were black string bands and black musicians playing old-time string band music, as is demonstrated on exceptional recordings, document records, string bands, and Rounder Records, ultimate black string band music from the Library of Congress. And so in the 20th century, we do have some incredible practitioners of this music being represented. Jim and Andrew Baxter, Jim Booker, Irving Cook and Leonard Bowles, Jimmy Struthers and Homer Walker, John Jackson, the James Cole String Band, Peg Leg Howell and Eddie Anthony, Nathan Frazier, Frank Patterson, Murphy Gribble, John Lusk, Albert York, John Snipes, Dink Roberts, Jamie Alston, Joe and Odell Thompson, Wilbert Atwater, Theodore Jackson, and just a new release just came out for his music, Texas Fiddler. So what we know is that there is a rich history of African American string band music. We know that there is a rich history of fiddle banjo music that came out of rural pockets across the country. We know that there was crossover of this music between black and white folks. And we know that the same Celtic African fusions that birthed these early string music traditions were also used against black folks by Irish folks in the birth of minstrelsy, as Scots-Irish culture re-identified itself away from a minority class and into an ever-growing dominant white culture. So the time that the music of black culture was being used to corrupt the image of black folks through blackface, it was simultaneously being shifted as a style of music predominantly played by white culture, recasting the music as not something rural, which could have been attributed to both black and white culture, but something rural and white. To be clear, this doesn't stop this music being played in black culture, but it creates an opportunity for a narrative to be written that erases black culture from its origins. And that's something to stew on. And we've seen that before. The king of jazz, the king of swing, the king of rock and roll.
These two pieces is played by Blind Pete, George Rand, Jacqueline Hen, and Black Bottom Ain't Got No Bottom by September the 27th, 1934, Little Rock, Arkansas, to the Congress in Washington.
This section is gonna get a little heavy, so I hope you're ready for it. Strap in. Black culture is not a monolith. It's important because there is a historical observation that must be made from the incredible evolution of black music in this country. In the world, certainly, but in this country for this context. There are important considerations in today's lack of presence of black culture in rural styles like country and old time. As mentioned above, the success of the recording industry in assigning stereotypes of music by race is one of those considerations. But that in turn lent to the erasure of black culture from the narrative of string band music and country music, as we talked about. You know, what the Black Banjo Gathering in 2005 was able to do, or what we've seen demonstrated by groups like the Carolina Chocolate Drops or, Lil Nas X, or if we go back further, right, the efforts of, not the efforts, but the life of Joe and Odell Thompson, or even something like even people like Darius Rucker or now like Miko Marks. This music has not, nor will it ever leave the black community nor the black narrative. The question is, when is the white community going to accept that truth and do their part to remember it, right? The other observation that must be remembered and mentioned through this evolution of music styles is that string band, blues, jug band, jazz, bebop, rock and roll, R&B, soul, funk, disco, hip hop, techno, and on and on and on and on and on, is not just an enduring example of perseverance, ingenuity, and innovation, but all of those things amidst the financial, social, cultural, and financial theft of that black culture at the same time. Black culture is resilient in that it has remained allegiant to those older traditional styles amidst the exploitation of those styles, so that evolving into something new becomes a habit in order to hold on to your identity. You know, I think one of the great examples is hip hop. Hip hop is a hip hop music, rap music is a continuation of an oral form of communication, of an oral form of expression that goes back to the dozens, but also looks to the past for much of its new music, anyways. You know, Snoop Dogg would talk all the time about how he would spend his times as a child in the house with his mom playing records. And to think that like so much of the music that he put out sampled, the funk and the Motown and the soul that he grew up listening to. The music is not forgotten. It necessarily has to be evolved, right? The recording industry, that we talked about of its inception, is much more of a monster now than it was then, and requires that type of constant innovation and re-identification. But because it is such an exploitative industry by nature, black culture has constantly needs to push itself into different directions. let's put it in the context of this festival. And also, I love this festival. I really do. I love all the styles of music. I love that there are old people, that there are young people, that there are families. If we have a white person coming to teach blues violin, who's to ever think that who's to ever think, especially if you're a young kid or something like that, that the black folks ever were the ones to play these styles of music and create these types of syncopations and these types of runs and these types of um, uh, melodies and harmonies, right? Now, I'm not saying that white folks can't be practitioners of other cultures' music, but when you populate a scene uh, and headline a scene with folks that don't represent the culture, it becomes problematic. The myriad blues festivals that exist in this country, in this world, where the headliners are white folks. It's a simple question that has a simple answer. The time is up for getting away with the colorblind mentality, the colorblind routine. Color is real. I'm a black man, proud of it. I don't want somebody looking at me and saying, I don't see color with you, I just see a person. That doesn't work. I want you to know that I am a black man, because that is part of my experience. It is part of everything that makes up me. Blues is black music. Just like the folks they got demonstrating Irish music are Irish. So should it be for black and POC styles and culture. If we're going to insist that practitioners be stewards of the tradition, why can't we insist that they be from the culture too? Otherwise, it's imitation. I would rather bring in a new or different style of fiddling that has proper representation than insist that a style be covered and to do so without that proper representation. This is how we create an absence in the continuity of this style in our history books. When we rewrite history books, that's what we're doing. This is how we erase folks from the history books, by not having them present. It might seem like a little thing, but it is everything. It is all the things. It's a routine that has been used for hundreds of years in the systemic creation of whiteness to support capitalism. And so it is conditioned in us. I'm not saying that, necessarily we do this stuff on purpose, but now we have the language, we have the tools, we have the research, we have we've been having the dialogue to be able to do better. So let's do better. Creole music. Often the French spoken folk music found in Louisiana gets divided into two camps, Cajun and Zydeco. And this is a gross misnomer because while both of the styles do in fact exist, no doubt, the much older Creole culture and tradition is often left out of the conversation. Louisiana was owned by the Spanish, the English, the French, but it was the French that had the most lasting impression on the colony. The Black Creole culture has many roots, largely coming out of the West Indies. Creole fiddle goes back as far as the 17th century, when French-speaking freed Africans from Haiti came over to Louisiana. One of the most famous Creole musicians, Amide Ardouin, first recorded in 1928, 29, and then the following year with Cajun fiddler Dennis McGee. He's credited as a major influence in the roots of Cajun music, the roots of which Creole music stemmed from Congo Square, where enslaved Africans would meet on Sunday, their day off, to play drums, dance, and sing, and play music, and engage with each other. You know, it's those roots that built up Creole music. You know, and there's a recognition to be made in the relationship between Creole and Cajun. It's a beautiful dynamic of, you know, in so many ways, Louisiana is an enigma of the rest of the states of this country in that kind of mezclar, that mixing that was able to happen, certainly in New Orleans, but, you know, spread out into other parts of the state. And so notable players, you know, include Conrad Fontenot and Calvin Carrière, Boysac Ardouin, but also contemporary folks like Ed Poulard and Djalma Garnier and Cedric Watson. You know, Creole music is a beautiful tradition. Creole culture is a beautiful culture and tradition, and something that should be represented and not excluded because of its proximity to the other things. You know, and if we're going to, and because Zydeco kind of removes strings from it, you know, I think it's even more important that that Creole is represented as much as possible, because there are stewards out there that represent that. Jazz. To call jazz America's classical music does a disservice to the art form. Jazz is a beautiful and sometimes painful culmination of 300 years of black culture pushing new boundaries and continuing to push and push and push as the environments change, and as society requires something new from it. It is the re-identification of itself again and again. In many ways, it's the perfect example of the black musical experience in this country. It includes string band, old-time music, gospel, jubilee, minstrelsy, vaudeville, marching band, ragtime, blues, tin pan alley, jug band, you name it. What it stands for to me is the black culture's incredible ability to re-identify itself while still holding on tight to the roots that it came from. Bebop is a wonderful example of how the music needed to change because of the environment that the music was being housed in. Notable players, notable string players, obviously, of the jazz tradition are Eddie South, Steph Smith, Ray Nance, Regina Carter, Samuel Williams, Leroy Jenkins, Noel Porter, some guy named Benjamin Hunter. I don't know. Jug band. Man, in my opinion, jug band music is a triumph to the innovation and dexterity of African American music. Even within the jug band genre, the variation of styles demonstrates the breadth of its scope. In Louisville, Clifford Hayes, Earl McDonald, Cal Smith, the music is unlike any of the other examples of jug band music that we have. It was nestled along the Ohio River, tributary to the mighty Mississippi. Louisville was heavily influenced by the music coming up from New Orleans, from Memphis, from St. Louis on the riverboats. And with the brilliant jug playing of Earl, their sound was way more characteristic of jazz playing. But in the context of folks like Clifford Hayes, who came up from the South and not only brought his upbringing of rural styles of folk fiddle music, but again, from that influence of folks coming up from the riverboat, was able to take that and translate that into something that was new and different while still holding true to the traditions that he was raised from. Listen to him play. It's phenomenal. He's one of my favorite violinists that come out of the American musical landscape. In Memphis, there was the Memphis Jug Band led by Will Shade, with a rotating cast of folks like Vol Stevens and Milton Roby and Charlie Pierce on the fiddle, and T.V. Blackman and Will Weldon and Charlie Burse, and even Memphis Minnie on guitar. And unlike their Louisville counterparts, the kazoo was the predominant alto instrument, and their sound carried a heavier country blues sound. But their styles were still all over the map because of the players that they had brought their own styles from. Memphis also was home to the great Gus Cannon and his Jug Stompers. So there was a whole bunch of stuff happening in Memphis that was including these string styles, and Memphis is by no means a huge city, not like Louisville either, but because they were off the river, there was this incredible mix between rural and urban styles. The Mississippi Sheiks were a group mainly consisting of family members, Bo, Lonnie, and Sam Chapman. And their biggest hit was the, Sitting on Top of the World, we probably all know. But they also had, fiddle-forward songs like the Chic Waltz. And a derivative of the group, the Mississippi Mudsteppers, which is a great name, but also was a great group, recorded some of the great string band tunes that we know of, including the two waltzes, Alma Waltz and Sunset Waltz, but also the famous Jackson Stomp. So this is all a mix of old time. This is old time evolved, right? String band music exists in so many different ways and in so many different levels and fashions. There was also the Cincinnati Jug Band and King David's Jug Band, and these notable players: Clifford Hayes, Vol Stevens, Lonnie and Bo Chapman. Look them up. Blues music, it's impossible to speak of this genre in any real definable terms. Blues is part and parcel of any and all the forms of the music that we're talking about here. Because of its universal range, just like jazz, the roots of this music only deepen my convictions about black culture's ability to reimagine itself amidst the pressures of co-optation from white mainstream industry. listening to, you know, the practitioners of this music, the folks that took it to new heights, you can really get a feel for not only how the style of playing was able to develop, um, but how it still maintained one of its original sole purposes, to be a voice. I mean, the violin as a vocal imitator is something that is found in all of Black cultural music. You know, it's in blues, it's in jazz, it's in jug band. But notable players include Henry Sun Sims, Eddie Anthony, Andrew Baxter, Howard Armstrong, who came to fiddle tunes, Papa John Creech, Clarence Gatemouth Brown, Lonnie Johnson, Don Sugarcane Harris. You know, the list goes on of 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 who helped push this forward.
Look here, mama, I come to take you back. I don't want you to talk no way slack. I'm going to the...
So if if Black culture must continue to re-identify itself, does that mean that we cannot include that re-identity into these traditional styles when the tradition is in re-identifying oneself? I mean, that's a really powerful question and something that I think we should really think about hard, right? The luxury of Irish music to maintain its Irishness, the luxury of Quebecois to maintain its Quebecoisness, the luxury of Cape Breton music to maintain its Cape Bretonness, the luxury of the various old time styles in the United States that whose practitioners are white, to be able to maintain that style of music. That is a privilege, that is a luxury, because nobody is trying to co-opt it. Black folks and people of color in this country have had to constantly reimagine their identities because their identities are constantly stripped away from them. Taken, repackaged, repurposed, reused, with a new face on it, with, you know, bejeweled outfits. I'm speaking to Elvis, but then, you know, all of Elvis's followers, it's endless. And that's really the question. That's really the thing that we need to be thinking about the most here, is that, you know, considering the history, considering the multiple styles of music that Black folks have been the originators of, the ideas of absence and erasure must be considered in this music and in the art form and in the culture and in anything that we're talking about in this country that applies to race, which is everything, right? But that's not what this music is about. That's not what Fiddle Tunes is about. Fiddle Tunes is about bringing all of our cultures together and sharing them. But in order to do that, in order for it to be the fusion that it needs to be, in order for it to be the authentic type of sharing that it needs to be, we need to make sure that all the right people are there to represent the styles that need to be represented. If we just have dominant culture imitating all the styles, then you're not authentically sharing the music. You know, there are a variety of styles that make up black and brown and indigenous categories all across the country. And those all need to be included in the conversation too. I mean, think about how cool we could really be expanding our festivals to if we opened ourselves up to that type of opportunity. And that's the step that we need to be taking. Those are the things we need to be thinking about. That's the echelon which we should be striving to make our festivals and to make our schools and our workshops and our learning centers for this music. Because if music can do it, because music can do it, it really has that power, and we need to just take down the guardrails that have prevented us from doing that for so long. So that's what I wanted to talk about, y'all. I want to thank you all for spending your time listening to me rant and rave, but really to talk about what I feel are missing links in the Americana roots scene that could really do a lot of good to let music do what it does best, which is heal and get us to see each other. And so that's ultimately what we're striving for, right? With these conversations and with these and with this type of thinking. I hope you guys enjoy Coviddle Tunes, and I hope you get a chance to go to Joe Siemens's workshop, where he'll be talking about some of these things, and Jerron Paxton's what is it, conversations with John or something like that, which I'm sure will be very insightful. He's an insightful brother. So thank you again to Fiddle Tunes for having me. Thank you for being open to this conversation, and I hope that I'll see all of you guys next year. Peace.